touch the world, but it couldn't feel me. Man's empty praise and treasures that fade are never enough. Then you came along and put me back together. Every desire is now satisfied here in your love. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing, nothing is better than you. No, there's nothing better, Lord. Oh, I'm not afraid to show you my weakness.
Show you my weakness.
Failures and flaws. Lord, you've seen them all. And you still call me friend. But I know, because the God of the mountain, He's the God of the valley. There's not a place your mercy and grace won't find me again. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you. Lord, there's nothing is better than you. Said I know for myself, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you. Lord, there's nothing is better than you. Said there's nothing in this world that compares to you, Lord. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. Come on, sing it out. Hey. You turn mourning to dancing. your presence in this place. We welcome you.
Can't go back to the beginning. Can't control what tomorrow will bring. But I know here in the middle is the place where you promised to be. I'm not enough unless you come, unless you come. Will you meet me here again?
'Cause all you are,
'Cause all you want, it's all you are. Will you meet me here again?
oh, need us here, Lord. So we feel your presence as I walk.
As I walk out through the valley,
Let your love
let your love rise above every fear.
like the sun,
Like the sun shaping the shadow,
my weakness.
in my weakness your glory appears.
Let your glory appear. I'm not enough
Not enough
unless you come.
unless
They are some of the most oft-quoted words of the Apostle Paul. They are commonly used when we offer words at a funeral over a faithful saint of God. We will reflect on the life being memorialized, and will embrace the life summary which Paul employs of his own passage. For I am now ready to be offered, the great apostle said, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. I'm hard-pressed to find a more desirable epitaph than this. I fought a good fight. I've kept the faith. I've finished my course. Please tell me what more a man could want than to be able to have those words spoken over him at the end of his earthly journey. I chose my battles wisely. I didn't fight just every fight, because not every fight's a good fight. But when I found something of value that was worth fighting for, I buckled in and I fought with everything I had. I fought a good fight. Fought with a death grip on my faith. Nothing and no one could tear this truth from my fingers. When others abandoned it, I kept it. When it was politically incorrect to cling to it, I kept it in spite of the ridicule. And when it cost me something in possessions or relationships, I kept it nonetheless. I kept the faith. And I didn't run for just a little while. I didn't stop when the pathway was steep and rocky. I didn't get discouraged just because I got weary. Even when others seemed to have a smoother journey, I just kept going. I didn't stop one step before the end of my assignment. I finished my course. I fought with patience. I kept with passion. And I finished with perseverance. I ask you again, what could be better than that life summary? May we all do as well. But the thing that captures my attention today is Paul's audience. It's natural for old men to speak to one another about such things, but Paul is not discussing his life with his peers. He is doing so with his protege. The words in our text, as you well know, are directed to a young preacher, one Paul has invested in, one he has mentored, one into whom he has poured life lessons and scriptural truth, and it is to that one that Paul makes this declaration. And it just hardly seems necessary to me. I mean, why would Paul need to defend his spiritual legacy to Timothy? Timothy had no doubts. I assure you that when I stood by my bishop's bedside at the close of his journey, Timothy A. Dugas did not have to validate his life to me. He didn't need to offer some expression of his standing. I knew who he was. I knew what he had done. There would have been no reason for him to exert his waning strength describing to me his spiritual accomplishments. And yet Paul is investing a portion of his final inspired letter to chronicle to a young man his fight, his faith, and his finish. But in another sense, I suppose it is only natural that when a man reaches that point, he looks to the generation that is coming behind him. He realizes as he's invested his life into something that means more to him than life. And it is only natural to consider what will become of it when he is off the scene. I want to be very clear. I don't feel like I'm anywhere near about done, but it requires only basic mathematical skills to look at an actuarial table and understand where I am in life. This very service has had two preachers, a young one and the other one. And I am the other one. I accept and realize that I have more sunsets behind me than I have before me. I've preached more messages than I will yet preach. There's more of past tense verbs regarding my service in His kingdom than there is of future tense verbs. And when I realize that, it does something inside of me. I want to see a generation that follows me do even more than I've ever done. Tonight I want to express to a generation of Timothys that I want you to preach greater messages than I've ever stood to a pulpit with. I want you to reach more people than I ever did or ever will. I want you to build bigger church congregations than I ever saw. I want your passion after God to eclipse mine. When I reflect on my life, I want it to reflect on yours. I don't believe Paul made his expression to Timothy to provide definition of his own life, but to shape the boundaries of Timothy's life. Timothy, when you see what I fought for, fight for those same things. Timothy, when you see the faith that I kept against all opposition, keep that same faith. Timothy, when you see the pathway that I finished, make that same commitment to finish yours. I preach tonight, and I'm highly honored to do so for the same reason. In the course of this conference, we have all reflected on 75 years of the history of the United Pentecostal Church, and I'm grateful. It is right and proper and enriching to celebrate names like Goss and Urshan and Witherspoon and Chambers and Haney and Volga and a host of others, too numerous to list. Men who invested their lives into the work of the kingdom within the framework of the United Pentecostal Church International. But if we end this week and we end this conference, virtual though it may be, with nothing more than a warm feeling about our heritage, I do not believe we will have completely accomplished God's purpose for this meeting. I have the unique privilege tonight to preach to the Gosses and the Urshans and the Witherspoons who are still doing their algebra homework. I preach tonight to the Chambers and the Haneys and the Volgas who are still dreaming of a driver's license. I preach to great young people who have a passion to do great things for a great God, and I want to be very clear. The UPCI needs you. The UPCI believes in you. The UPCI loves you. Thank God we've grown, but we still have to grow. Thank God for every city reached, but there are still unreached cities. Thank God for every country we've reached, but there are still unreached countries we have not yet seen. God do everything He wants to do with us. And so it is natural that we would turn our attention to the youth of this movement, to high school students with a burning desire to fight the good fight, to young adults with a deep commitment to keep the faith, to young preachers who don't know where their courses may lead just yet, but who are determined to finish them just like Paul did. To those tonight, I want to take you to a place where John meets George. To get to that place, we must journey over a century back in time. Let me introduce you first to John. John Parr. John was born in Litchfield Grove, a suburb of London, as the youngest of 11 children born to a milkman. The majority of his siblings died before their 4th birthday. Upon leaving school, he took a job working as a butcher boy and then as a caddy at North Middlesex Golf Course. And then, like many other young men at the time, he was attracted to the British Army as a potentially better way of life, one where he could at least get 2 meals a day and a chance to see the world. At only 5'3" in height, John joined the 4th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment as a professional soldier in 1912 at only 14 years of age, claiming to be 18 years and 1 month to meet the minimum age requirement. He became an infantry scout with the 4th Middlesex Regiment. His role was to ride ahead of the battalion with a detachment mounted only on bicycles and to detect the enemy or points of military note, and then return with all possible speed to notify the battalion commanding officer of what lay ahead. On the outbreak of the First World War in early August 1914, the 4th Middlesex Regiment was mobilized and was among the first army units of the British Expeditionary Force to cross the English Channel into France. With the Imperial German Army invading Belgium and France at that moment, Parr's unit took up a position near the town of Mons, approximately 8 miles away from the rest of their forces. On August 21st, 1914, John Parr and another cyclist were sent to the village of Oberg, just northeast of Mons and just over the border of Belgium, to locate where the Germans were. While doing this, they encountered a patrol from the German forces doing the same thing. John volunteered to remain behind and to hold off the enemy while his companion pedaled furiously back to carry the report. While buying time for the message of the Germans' advance to be delivered, Parr was killed in an exchange of rifle fire, thus becoming the first British soldier to die in World War I, ironically called at the time the war to end all wars. That's John. Now let's meet George. George Edwin Ellison. George was born in the city of York in northern England on August 10th, 1878. His family later lived in Leeds. He first joined the British Army as a regular soldier in 1902. By 1912, he had left to engage in the backbreaking work of mining coal in the early 20th century. Sometime just before the outbreak of World War I, he was recalled to the Army, joining the 5th Royal Irish Lancers and serving from the very start of the conflict. He fought in that Battle of Mons in which John Parr was killed. George Ellison, however, survived that conflict and several others as well. In fact, he was still faithfully serving when the armistice was signed at 5:45 a.m. on November 11th. Given the rather primitive nature of communications, authorities knew that it would take some time to get word to all the troops. And so in that, it was 11:11, they decided to declare the cessation of hostilities would occur at 11 a.m. And that simple decision proved tragic for George, who was on patrol in the woods on the outskirts of Mons. Yes, that same place where John Parr was killed. 9:30 a.m., just 90 minutes before the guns fell silent, George was shot and killed by a sniper while he was on his final patrol, thus becoming the last British soldier killed in World War I. These two deaths are separated by 4 years of absolute horror and bloodshed. But one need not travel to diverse, remote, barren battlefields to honor these two war heroes. In fact, one need not travel to two locations at all. They can both be found in one place, St. Symphorien Military Cemetery in Belgium. These quiet grounds near the twice-referenced town of Mons enshrine in honor the remains of some 230 British soldiers who gave their lives to fight off the Kaiser and the forces of the German alliance, among them John and George. But even there, one need not traverse all across the hallowed grounds to locate the two of them, for accidentally nobody planned it, but perhaps providentially. John and George are buried but 15 feet apart and facing one another. You can stand in one place and look to your left and see John. You can look to your right and see George. There, the first British soldier to fall in the conflict is buried facing the last British soldier to fall in the conflict. The one who began the struggle is entombed looking toward the one who ended the struggle. If you'll allow me just a little liberty this evening, I think these two graves must undoubtedly speak to one another. I think George must speak to John must speak to George and say, my generation set the bar. We showed you what devotion looked like. We demonstrated just what it might cost to advance this cause. We marched out somewhat ill-prepared, but we were more than willing to do anything our commander required. I died before this was finished, but I gave my all. And now, George, I have some questions for you. When you finish your battle, when they play taps for you, when your tombstone is erected just across from mine, will you still love this cause like my generation loved it? Are you willing to die for what I died for? Are you still wearing the uniform? Do you still follow orders? Did you still withstand the enemy like my peers did? Yes, I know you likely had some new weapons. You probably had some new procedures. And it's entirely likely I might not have completely fit in or felt completely comfortable with all the new methods of combat. But I just want to know if the core values we fight for that consumed and still beat in my heart, are they still in yours? And did the passion that leaked from my wounds still flow from yours? And I have to think that before that sniper bullet took George's military career to an end, just an hour and a half before peace was to arrive, I have to wonder if George didn't answer back from his grave to John and say, I want you to know, every time I looked at your sacrifice, I was challenged to fight on. I never passed your grave without gratitude for what you did and how you started this conflict. I know that my generation is a debtor to the price you paid. And I want you to know, sir, I am committed to finishing this thing. I will not quit. I will not surrender. You can count on me. I will ensure that your sacrifice, elder, was not in vain. What a place to stand between John and George. And yet that's where we are tonight. Between those who gave their all at the outset of the battle and those who will still be fighting when the end comes. To pass between rows and know that you're flanked on one side by those whose battle is finished and faithfully gave their all, and you're flanked on the other side by a generation who will bring this thing to victory. To look one direction, see the multitude of those who testify with Paul that they finished their course, and to look the other direction and see 35,000 at Youth Congress who are still on their courses. To hear the voice of our elders speak and ask a younger generation who now serves some very salient questions. Do you still love what we loved? Will you live for what we died for? Are you still obeying the voice of your commander? Have you kept the faith? And to hear the echoes of thousands of consecrated young people all across the UPCI who answer back with passion, we love what you gave us. What you believe is precious to us. We still believe there's one God and that His name is Jesus. We still proclaim the apostolic message. What Simon Peter delivered, what you picked up, what you gave to us, we are still giving to the world. We look at John, we see brush arbors. We look at George, we see P7 clubs. We look to John, we see harvest time. We look to George, we see podcasts. We look to John, we see cassette tapes. We look to George, we see digital streaming services. But I want to remind everybody of something else. Please hear me right now. Here's the good news. John preached Acts 2 and John 3. George still preaches Acts 2 and John 3. John believed in separation from the world. George is still demonstrating separation from the world. John was driven by the Great Commission. George is still driven by the Great Commission. The tombstones look just alike. They denote membership in the same army. And they testify to equal sacrifice. Standing between John and George, we are flanked by profound commitment on both sides. I want you to hear me tonight. There are no bounds to what this present generation of apostolic youth now fighting in the conflict can be and do. But George, you younger folk, I encourage you, you need to meet John. Their stories must not be swallowed up by the passage of time. As I pass between the rows, I pause at the stone of Jack Yance, who after serving at the UPCI headquarters as the director of home missions, now North American missions, at an age when retirement made more sense, at 65 years old, he left his job at headquarters to go to Chicago to plant another church. Stop with me momentarily, if you will, at the grave of Werner Larson, missionary to Colombia, who when his wife died on the mission field, he built her casket with his own hands and dug her grave and buried her himself so that he could stay there to carry on what God had called him to do. The stories are too many to tell tonight, but please, George, don't hurry past John's grave without pausing to take note. Please pause there a minute and hear the preaching of N.A. Urshan. Go for a plane ride with Benny DeMerchant. Feel the anointing as Merle Ewing would sing. Witness the humble worship of C.M. Becton as he rolled across a general conference platform in humble worship. Experience the passion for truth and evangelism from a Gerald Mangan as he twirls that finger in the air. Those and 1,000 others are the John Parrs that started this conflict. But you see, John, you need to know that George Ellison is still fighting too. There are stories on the other side too. John, the elders, I encourage you to meet George. Over here is 22-year-old Callie Dibbs from Appleton, Wisconsin. She was won through her local P7 club and then sacrificed because she knew if it hadn't been for Sheaves for Christ, she'd have never made it to the church. So she purposed she was going to raise more money for Sheaves for Christ than any young person in Wisconsin. And Callie became the real McCoy that year. Then she went on an AYC trip overseas, and it so gripped her that she has now applied for a teaching job abroad just so she could spread the gospel and be involved in missions. Between John and George, between Werner Larson in Colombia and Callie Dibbs from Appleton, who is going overseas on her own mission. Their commitment to missions beyond our borders reflect on each other. Over here, please see them. John, take a look at George. Over here, a couple high school seniors from Jackson, Missouri, Zoe Freeman and Hunter Reese. Zoe is from a troubled home. She lives with her grandparents. She heard about a P7 club, didn't even know what it was. She was just in junior high at Missouri Youth Convention, and she heard about it. And though she was only a junior high, some would say, what could she do? I'll tell you what she did. She went back to her junior high and started a P7 club. And then when she moved on to high school, she started one there, having turned that one over to somebody else. Hunter Reese came into that high school P7 club his freshman year. He came with his girlfriend. He was a self-proclaimed atheist and only came to roll his eyes at these nuts that believed in Jesus. But when it was done, he had a lot of questions for Zoe, so she invited him to a Wednesday night youth service and then to Sunday services. Pastor tells me it is possible he was coming more to see Zoe than to meet God, but she wouldn't date him because he wasn't in church. Zoe taught him a home Bible study. In the spring of their sophomore year, he attended Missouri Youth Convention. And on Thursday night, he told the youth pastor he wanted to be baptized. There was only one option. So they went to the swimming pool of the hotel, and there they buried him in the name of Jesus Christ. So this young man who came to mock them is now becoming one of them. And just a couple months later, he went to Missouri Youth Convention, and there he was baptized with the Holy Ghost. And now, this past fall, now their junior year, Zoe and Hunter are team leading the P7 club, now recognized as a formal club in their high school with all the rights of any other club. In fact, his pastor told me Hunter is such a brilliant young man. He has been the go-to guy that has carried all of their online streaming and tech needs during this pandemic. Pastor Brown reports to me that they are integral to his church, and they have totally turned the things around in their youth group. No, neither one has started a church just yet like Brother Yance did, but they looked at his grave and they saw his commitment, and they said, we can't start a church yet, but we can start a P7 club at our high school. No, they don't get any Christmas for Christ money just yet, but they are raising, and I want somebody to hear me. This generation is finishing the fight that this generation started. Don't despair about George. George still loves the truth. George still lives holy. George still believes this gospel. 75 years of sacrifices confront this generation. So George, if we seem a little protective of the UPCI, it's only because we know what was given by John. And John, if we seem a little excited about the future of the UPCI, it's only because we know what's being given by George. And I got good news for you tonight, young people. Hear me as you listen to the last few moments here. The Master already knows the date of the ceasefire. And it's not going to be by mutual agreement of two sides. There was only an armistice signed at the end of World War I. No victor, just we decided to stop fighting. But I promise you, in this conflict, young man, that you're in, your Father has already declared who the victor is going to be. And you're on the side that is going to be the champion. This church, his church, is a victorious church. And John and George are both going to win if the elder can see and trust the consecration of the younger, and if the younger can be compelled and guided by the consecration of the elder. If George could stop by John's grave and say, I know what you gave, and I'm going to live worthy of that. And if John could look at George and say, I trust you, I believe in you, you're doing great things tonight. My comfort is to tell the youth and the young adults of the UPCI that we believe in you. There is a place and a work for you. You matter. You are vital. But the call tonight and the challenge tonight is to tell the youth and the young adults, you must not measure your kingdom commitment by your peers, but by the legacy of profound sacrifice that is buried in the very fabric of this great organization. Over the next 75 years, there must be continued generations of missionaries and church planners and evangelists who are just as dedicated to the work of God as John was. Whose stories will be told a generation from now? George, we're going to be talking about you. So, young man, I pose the question to you. What will you do with 75 years of history of the United Pentecostal Church behind you? What will you do with innumerable sacrifices that have been made to bring us where we are? Young lady, what will you give? Can you place your life on an altar and serve Him passionately and serve Him first? Will you start a P7 club? Will you teach a home Bible study? Will you go on an AYC trip? Will you answer God's call to be a preacher and build the church for decades to come? Can you follow His call to be an engineer or a businessman or a laborer or a professional and bless your local church as a faithful saint of God? I ask you a simple question. When you see the sacrifices that have been made by those that came before, can you lay your life alongside theirs and say, my commitment matches theirs? George, John's life and John's death called you to an altar tonight. 75 years of the UPCI's history depends on your willingness to mirror the sacrifices that have made it what it is. And so in your home or in your youth room or in your church or wherever you're watching this, there has to be an altar. You know why? Because John always had an altar. You want to know why Werner Larson had that kind of commitment in Colombia? He had an altar. You want to know why Brother Janssen, 65 years old, said, I got to start another church? He had an altar. You want to know what's going to shape and compel and drive your life? You got to have an altar. So I'm asking you, I know this is a different way to have church. It's a different way to have conference. You're watching a screen and we're not there in person. But I plead with you, let your response be measured not by the media, but by John. Let your response be measured not by the methodology, but by the sacrifice of those who came before us. And I plead with you where you are right now to move from your chair, move from where you are, even if it's nothing more than just getting down in front of that chair and getting on your knees. But could you take a quick look over at John's grave and say, I'm George, and I have to live in a way that measures up to what he gave. I'm asking young people all across North America and around the world that may be watching, the altar is now. The kingdom needs you. The United Pentecostal Church needs you. And I plead with you to move and set up an altar where you are this moment and pray that your life would do honor to all those who came before us, because the world and the United Pentecostal Church is waiting on you. Come on, pray. Go ahead.
I want more of you, God.
Pray.
I want more of you, God. Set a fire down in my soul.
Reach to Him.
I can't contain, I can't control.
Reach to Him.
I want more of you, God. I want more of you, God. Set a fire down.
Go ahead, George. Go ahead, George. Pray prayers like John prayed. Go ahead and make commitments like John made. Go ahead and do what your elders did and give your life to Him.